if you have two LaunchPads and you want to debug both of them at the same time because one is talking to the other, that's possible. There are a few things you have to do in Code Composer Studio to make it work, but it's not too hard. Let's go through the steps. There are three things that we have to learn. One thing is to know which of our LaunchPads is going to be the transmission one and which is going to be the receiver one, and know how we can address them from our debugger. The second thing we have to learn is how to run two instances of Code Composer Studio, because we want to have two debuggers running at the same time, one for the transmission and one for the receiver. And then the third thing is that we have to take care that each Code Composer Studio instance knows to which of the two LaunchPads it's talking. Because it's the same type of LaunchPad with the same debugger type, it's a bit tricky. We really have to tell Code Composer Studio the serial number of the debugger on these LaunchPads to take care that our transmission session is talking to the transmission LaunchPad and our receiver debug session is talking to the receiver. Also needed for the code upload, if we have two different firmwares for the transmission logic and receive logic, we have to take care that when we load the code that it goes to the right LaunchPad. The first part is very easy. You just label them, one as a transmission LaunchPad and the other as a receiver LaunchPad. You just randomly tag a label on them, and from the moment you have tagged them, they know what they are. And then we have to know what the serial number is of each of them. So let's first plug in the first LaunchPad, the transmission one. And Code Composer Studio comes with a tool to ask the serial number of the debugger. So we go to the directory where we installed Code Composer Studio and then navigate to Code Composer Studio base, common XDS utilities. I'll put the command in the video because I can't pronounce it. And then we ask the debugger what its serial number is. And you do that by executing the command XDS Kung E, and then you have it here. Here you see the serial number of your LaunchPad, and this one is L2301JO. You'll never forget it once you've written it down on the LaunchPad. Then you can just eject the LaunchPad and put in the other one, the receiver, and you run the same command. You'll see that you get a different number. For this receiver LaunchPad, we know that it's L2301KI. So I'm writing that on both labels, so it will be easier later on to know which LaunchPad has what address. Our next task is to take care that we can run two separate instances of Code Composer Studio. And you do that by telling Code Composer Studio that it has to ask for our repository every time it starts. You do that by going to Window Preferences. When you've navigated to General, Startup Options, Workspace, you can say Prompt for Workspaces on Startup. And now every time that Code Composer Studio starts up, it will ask you what workspace to use. And this is handy in this particular situation where we're talking to two different LaunchPads, because we can have one workspace for the receiving side, one for the transmission side, because we will have one instance of Code Composer Studio debugging the one LaunchPad and one instance debugging the other one. Once you've done this exercise, you can close Code Composer Studio and you'll have to restart it again. Once you restart it, it will now prompt for your workspace, and you can create a new one. We'll make one workspace for the receiver and one for the transmitter. So I'll start with the transmitter one. So let's select a new workspace. I'll go to my home folder and create a new folder. I'll call it workspace v6tx for the transmission code and start Code Composer Studio. I'll do the same later on for the receiver workspace, but you get the drill. Once we have this workspace, we can go to Browse Examples and look for our transmission example. It should be under the TI RTOS for CC13XXX. Let's go there for our LaunchPad, and I'm just going to take the transmission example RF packet TX. I import it into the workspace and we're halfway there. I've now plugged in both launchpads, so you can see that I am really talking to the transmission launchpad when I compile and run this code. And the way I do that is by going to the imported project and look at the target configs folder. There is a target config file, and when we click on that and click on the target configuration, we can say that there is not only one debugger installed, but we can say that it has to talk to a particular serial number. And I had copied that serial number from the exercise we did earlier. So let's now check and see if it talks to this particular launchpad, the transmission launchpad, when I do the test. There we go, it's this one lighting up and not this one. So that's a good sign. We can now close Code Composer Studio and start it up again. Because we have put that flag there, it will again ask us for a workspace. Let's browse and create a new map, just like we did the previous time. The previous time we called our map transmit, so now we're going to create a new map that's called receive. And we'll do the same. We'll look for the receiver project this time. It's going to be in the same folders, the TI-RTOS for the CX13. For our launchpad, under the radio examples. So let's take the packet receiver example this time and import it. And what we have to do this time is again to go to the target configuration, but we'll have to fill in the serial number of the other debugger. Let's save and test, and this time the other one's lights burn. So we have two configurations now of Code Composer Studio, one for the transmission, one for the receiver. It may be a bit of overhead, but we have the possibility now to run a debug session on both of them at the same time on the same computer. Very handy if you are running a configuration where the two launchpads talk to each other and you want to step through the code on both devices. So let's see how this works in reality. Both launchpads are connected here. We'll first try the transmission part. So I'm going to do a test and the light of this launchpad should go on. So let's do the test connection. And there we go. Then I'll open the other Code Composer Studio session. I'll call it test again and we should see the light of this launchpad. So that means that we have control over both launchpads in a separate environment. I can now easily start the debugger on both of them. The transmission code will load on the transmission launchpad and it will be ready for debugging. You see the code loading now, so that's going fine. Now let's switch over to the other session, the receiver one, and do the same. We start the debugger and we should see things happening on this launchpad. You see that now the code is loading, and from this moment on both launchpads are ready for debugging. So you see that we have two debugging sessions active, two launchpads active, and each debugger session knows exactly to which launchpads it's talking, and you can engage in the communication, start and stop wherever you want, and look at the attributes of the launchpad. And that's what I wanted to show today, give you the option to talk to both of these launchpads separately and individually. Happy debugging!